She came with 2 trunks, a letter of agreement, and a reputation for being unremarkable. That was the word they used in Clover Falls. Unremarkable. Not cruel, not unpleasant. Just the kind of woman who passed through a room without leaving much of an impression. Eliza Garrow had heard the word enough times that she'd stopped flinching at it. She folded it away somewhere deep and practical, the same place she kept other things that didn't serve her, and got on with the work of living. The letter had come in late February. A rancher in Harlan County, Montana, needed someone to manage his household and serve as a legal wife in name. There was land involved, a clause in his father's will, a deadline that was closing fast. The arrangement was clear. She would have her own room. She would manage the house and whatever else needed managing. In return, she would have a roof, a wage, and no further obligation beyond what was written on the page. Eliza had read the letter twice at the kitchen table of her sister's house in Bozeman, then folded it along its original crease and set it beside her coffee cup. She said yes before the week was out. Her sister Ruth had opinions about this. Ruth always had opinions. She stood in the doorway of Eliza's small room while Eliza packed, arms crossed, mouth pressed into the shape of everything she was trying not to say. "He's never met you," Ruth finally said. "That's correct," Eliza said, folding a wool skirt. "He doesn't know anything about you. He knows I can manage a house. He knows I'm available. That's what the letter asked for." Ruth was quiet for a moment then. "Eliza, you know what men like that expect." Eliza looked up then, just briefly. "Men like what?" Ruth didn't have an answer for that, and Eliza went back to packing. She wasn't naive. She understood the shape of the arrangement and everything it implied. She also understood that she was 31 years old, living in her sister's spare room, taking in mending from the neighbors, and that the life she'd been waiting for had not arrived on its own schedule. Some things you had to go and meet. The train ride took most of a day. A hired wagon took the rest. By the time the Calloway spread came into view, low house, long barn, fencing that ran as far as the eye could follow, the light had gone orange, and the air had the kind of bite to it that felt like a warning. The man who met her at the wagon was not the rancher. He was a lean, sun-darkened hand named Pete, who told her his name once, quickly, then lifted her trunks without being asked and carried them toward the house. She followed. The house was larger than she'd expected and colder than it looked, the kind of cold that settles into the walls over years when there's no woman's hand to seal the drafts. Gideon Calloway was waiting in the front room. He was taller than she'd pictured, darker. He had the look of a man who had worked outdoors long enough that the outdoors had worked its way into him. Weathered at the edges, quiet in the way that people become quiet when they spend more time with land than with people. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he's trying to assess fairly and finding it difficult. She looked back at him the same way. "Miss Garrow," he said. "Mr. Calloway." A pause. She could feel him taking inventory of her, the width of her, the plainness of her traveling dress, the way she stood without apology in the middle of his front room, holding her traveling bag with both hands. She had done this enough times in her life, been looked at and found wanting, that she had learned to simply stand still and let it happen, and not give it any more of herself than that. "The room is off the kitchen," he said finally. "Far end of the hall. Thank you. Hands eat at 6. Breakfast and supper. There's been no cook since March. I'll start tomorrow morning," she said. He nodded. Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, exactly, but a small recalibration, as if he'd expected protest and found none. "That's the arrangement then," he said. "That's the arrangement," she agreed. She found her room and closed the door behind her and stood in the dark for a moment before she lit the lamp. The room was plain and functional. A narrow bed, a washstand, 2 hooks on the wall, a window that looked out onto nothing but night and pasture. She set her bag down on the bed and looked at it for a long moment. Then she went to find the kitchen. It was worse than she'd been told. The stove was good, a fine iron range that someone had once cared for and hadn't been properly cared for since, but the rest of it had the look of a place that had been surviving rather than living. Pans piled without order, a flour bin that was nearly empty. Salt pork wrapped in cloth on the shelf when it should have been in a cool cellar. 2 crocks of dried beans and a tin of molasses, and not much else that she could see at a glance. She opened every cabinet. She counted what was there. She found a root cellar through the back door that had more than she'd expected. Turnips, some dried apples, a good supply of cornmeal, lard in a proper crock. Someone had laid in stores. Just no one to use them. She went to bed knowing exactly what she would make in the morning and in what order. She was up before light. The stove took some coaxing, but she knew how to talk to cast iron, knew the way a firebox needed to breathe before it would cooperate, and by the time the first gray came into the sky outside the kitchen window, she had it running clean and even. She set a pot of beans to soak the night before. She'd noticed them before she went to sleep and planned accordingly, and now she started on the morning's work. Cornmeal porridge with molasses, salt pork sliced thin and laid in the skillet in 2 careful rows. Biscuits, because there was enough flour for it, and because she knew what biscuits could do to a room full of hungry men. She was pulling the first pan from the oven when she heard boots in the yard. She did not stop what she was doing. She turned the biscuits onto the cloth and started on the second pan, and listened to the sound of men who did not yet know what was waiting for them. The first one through the door was a younger hand, freckled, with the look of someone not yet 20. He stopped in the doorway the way a person stops when they walk through a door and find something unexpected on the other side. "Morning," Eliza said without turning around. A silence. "Then you the new one?" "I am." She heard more of them behind him, the scrape of boots, the low murmur of men adjusting. She set the second pan in the oven and turned to face them. There were 4 hands in all. The freckled young one, she would learn later his name was Ty, stood at the front. Behind him, 2 older men who had the careful expressions of people who had learned not to expect too much. And behind them, filling the doorframe, a broad-shouldered man named Walt, who looked at the table, at the food laid on it, and then at her, in that order. "Sit down," she said, "before it gets cold." They sat. She watched them from the corner of her eye as she worked. The moment the first biscuit split open and the steam came out of it, something in the room changed. She had seen this before, the way a smell could undo a person's composure before they'd had a chance to prepare themselves. Ty ate the first biscuit in 4 bites and reached for a second before he'd swallowed the last of the first. Walt said nothing, but he ate slowly, deliberately, the way a man eats something he is paying close attention to. Gideon came in last, as she had half expected. He stopped just inside the doorway. She did not look up. She heard the pause, heard him take in the room, heard the slight shift in the quality of the silence. He sat. She set a plate in front of him without making a ceremony of it. He ate. She went back to the stove. Nobody said much. That was fine. She wasn't there for conversation. The following week established its own rhythm. She rose before 5. She had the stove going by 1:15. Breakfast was on the table by 10 to 6, and she had learned within the first 3 mornings exactly what each man ate, and how much, and in what order he liked to take it. Ty ate fast and would come back for thirds if she left anything out. Walt ate slowly and always cleaned his plate completely, which she took as the highest compliment. The other 2, brothers, she gathered, named Chet and Roy, ate the same way they did everything else, which was side by side and in approximate synchrony. Gideon ate apart from them. Not distant, exactly. He sat at the same table, but he had a quality of internal separation that she recognized. He was a man who was present without being available. She did not take this personally. She simply cooked and cleaned and began quietly to make the house into something that worked. The kitchen was the first project. She organized it from the bottom of the deepest shelf to the top of the highest hook, put things where they made sense, found 2 pots that had been buried under a pile of others that were actually quite good. She found a crack in the far wall where the cold came through and plugged it with rags, and told Ty about it one morning, and he fixed it properly by the end of the week without being asked twice. She mended the curtains in the front room, because they were letting in the wind, and because the fabric was still good, just needed attention. She found a broken hinge on the cellar door, and asked Gideon about it one evening, not in the way of a complaint, just as information, and he fixed it the next morning before breakfast. These were small things, but small things were how a house began to function, and a house that functioned made everything else easier. She did not ask for thanks. She did not expect it. She noted, however, that the men had begun to come to the table a few minutes early, which was not something she'd invented but simply observed, and which told her something. It was Walt who said it first. He was on his way out after supper one Thursday, a venison stew that had taken most of the afternoon, with dried apples and sage and a touch of the good vinegar she'd found in the cellar, and he paused at the door and turned back. "Better than anything at the Grover Inn," he said. Then he put his hat on and walked out. She stood in the kitchen and allowed herself, briefly, to feel that. Gideon did not compliment the food. He did not compliment much of anything. But she began to notice that he stayed a little longer in the kitchen after supper than he had in the first week. Not in a way that required anything of her. He might stand at the window for a moment, or check the firebox, or linger over a second cup of coffee. But he was there, and she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she did not mind. He was not easy. She had not expected easy. He spoke when he had something to say and not before. He was direct without being unkind, though his directness had a bluntness to it that a person could mistake for coldness if they were looking for warmth in the wrong place. She had known enough people in her life who talked more than they meant, and was not particularly sorry to know someone who meant more than he talked. One evening, near the end of her third week, she was in the kitchen going over the week's accounts. She had taken over the household ledger as part of what seemed practical, not because anyone asked, when Gideon came in and sat down at the other end of the table. She did not look up immediately. She was in the middle of a column. "You took the ledger," he said. "I did. I can hand it back if you want it." A pause. "How's it look?" "Better than it should, given the state of the stores when I arrived. You were losing money on supplies because nothing was being stored properly. The salt pork especially." She turned the ledger so he could see it if he wanted to. "I've adjusted the ordering. We should save about $12 next month, maybe more if the root cellar holds." He looked at the figures. She watched him without appearing to watch him. "You kept accounts before," he said. "It wasn't a question. My father's hardware shop. For 9 years. He was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled the ledger toward him and read through her notes and pushed it back. "Keep it," he said. She pulled it back and found her place and kept working. He didn't leave immediately. He sat with his coffee, and she sat with her columns, and the only sound in the kitchen was the fire and the occasional scratch of her pencil. It was, she thought, a strangely comfortable silence for two people who had barely spoken more than practical sentences to each other. The trouble, when it came from outside. She had gone into town, Harlan, such as it was, for supplies in the 5th week, riding in with Pete on the wagon. She didn't know many people in Harlan yet, and this was fine with her. But she heard things, the way you hear things in a small town when people don't realize the stranger in the dry goods store can hear them. Calloway married himself a housekeeper, one woman said to another 2 rows over. Seems so. Though I don't see why he needed to go all the way to Bozeman for one. Well, a pause. Perhaps there weren't a lot of options. She heard the rest of it in the particular tone of the pause, had heard that tone her entire adult life. She kept her eyes on the shelf in front of her and selected the things she needed and did not make herself smaller. She mentioned none of this to anyone at the ranch. What she did instead was make apple cake on Friday evening, because she had a good supply of dried apples and because it seemed like the right night for it. She made it the way her grandmother had taught her, with the brown sugar crust on top that cracked when you pressed it with a spoon. She set it on the table after supper and said nothing about it. Ty's eyes went wide. Roy said something to Chet in a low voice and Chet laughed. Walt looked at the cake and then at her and said quietly and with total sincerity, "Lord above." Gideon said nothing. He had a piece, then a second. He did not say anything about it. But she noticed, 2 mornings later, that he had taken a slice for his coffee and left the rest covered with a cloth, the way you cover something you want kept. April turned over into May, and May brought warmth and longer days and a great deal more work. She was not unaccustomed to hard work. It was one of the few things she had always had plenty of. But she had not expected to find herself genuinely absorbed in the ranch's business. She began to learn the rhythms of it, when the cattle needed moving, when the mending of equipment could wait, and when it couldn't, the particular tensions of spring that came with weather that couldn't be trusted. She learned these things not by asking about them, but by listening, by sitting quietly in the evenings with her mending when the men talked, and filing away what she heard. One evening Gideon mentioned, to no one in particular, that the bunkhouse roof had a section that was going to be a problem by fall. She said nothing then, but the next morning she found in the back of the cellar several lengths of cedar shingle she'd seen on her first day and set aside as potentially useful, and she mentioned them to Gideon at breakfast. He stopped, looked at her. "I didn't know those were there," he said. "They're behind the old feed shelves. Enough for the bunkhouse east section, I'd think. Maybe a bit more." He went to look after breakfast and came back and said, simply, "Good eye." She set his coffee in front of him and went back to the stove. The real shift happened in the 6th week, on a Tuesday, when 3 of Gideon's fence posts came down in the night and a small number of cattle got onto a neighbor's land. It was the kind of thing that could become a serious dispute in Harlan County, where land and boundary were as serious as Scripture. Gideon rode out before dawn with Chet and Roy. Ty stayed to help her with whatever she needed. She spent that morning making soup, a long bone broth she'd started the previous afternoon, and bread that needed time to rise, and she thought, as she worked, about what Gideon would come home to. She thought about this not in a wifely, performative way, but practically. He would be cold. He would be tired and tense. He would have spent hours dealing with a problem that could go several ways, none of them uncomplicated. He came back at noon. The neighbor, a man named Abbott, had agreed to a handshake resolution rather than anything that needed a judge. Chet and Roy went to the bunkhouse. Gideon came into the kitchen, and she set a bowl of broth in front of him before he'd taken off his coat. He sat down. He put both hands around the bowl. He didn't say anything for a long moment. She moved around the kitchen and left him to it. Then he said, without looking up, "How did you know to have it ready?" She considered the question honestly. "I didn't know. I just thought it was likely to be a hard morning." He was quiet again. When he looked up, she was at the counter slicing bread, and she wasn't looking at him, and this seemed to make it easier for him to say what he said next. "My wife," he said, "she didn't last 6 months out here, couldn't take the winters, left and didn't come back." Eliza set down the bread knife. She didn't turn around immediately. "How long ago?" she asked. 7 years. She picked up the knife again and finished slicing. She brought the bread to the table and set it down near the broth. "That's a long time to manage this place without help," she said. "Yes." She sat down across from him, which she hadn't done before, not at the table with him alone. She poured her own coffee and set the pot between them. "I'm not going to leave," she said, "for whatever that's worth at 6 weeks." He looked at her. Something in his expression, not quite a shift, more like a settling, the way a room settles after the wind stops. "It's worth something," he said. She nodded and picked up her coffee, and they sat without talking for a while, and outside the kitchen window, the May light came in yellow and warm across the floor, and it was, she thought, a reasonable enough thing. Not what she'd imagined her life would look like at 31, but reasonable, and with something in it that felt, if not like happiness exactly, then like the ground underneath happiness, like the bones of it. Summer came in earnest, and with it the realization, at least among the Harlan County social circuit, that Gideon Calloway's new wife could cook. This was established not by anything she said or did publicly, but by the fact that Walt and Ty, when they rode into town on Saturdays, had begun turning down the food at the Grover Inn. They'd eat there out of politeness, buy a coffee maybe, but the meals they'd once considered adequate had become, by comparison, a kind of disappointment. This was not something they broadcasted, but in a small town these things traveled. By June, 2 separate women had asked her for her biscuit recipe. She gave it to them freely. She was not interested in keeping things close when sharing them cost her nothing. By the 4th of July, when Gideon brought her to the town celebration because it was expected of them, and because there was a practical reason to be seen together in public, she had met enough people in Harlan to feel the shape of it, who was kind, who was cautious, who had decided to like her, and who had decided otherwise. The woman who had spoken in the dry goods store, her name, Eliza eventually learned, was Mrs. Hapworth, made a point of coming to speak with her at the celebration. She was a woman in her 50s with a gracious manner that Eliza recognized as the kind that costs very little when everything is going well. "We've heard wonderful things," Mrs. Hapworth said with a smile that was mostly smile. "Gideon looks well." "He works hard," Eliza said. "It suits him. And you're finding it agreeable? Ranch life?" "I'm finding it suits me fine," she said with the same simple directness she applied to everything, Mrs. Hapworth made a small sound that might have been approval or reassessment or both, and moved on, and Eliza turned back to the lemonade she'd been holding and felt Gideon appear beside her a moment later. "What did she want?" he asked. "To decide whether to be friendly with me." A pause. Then, "And? I think she'll manage it," Eliza said. "Eventually." He made a sound that she was beginning to recognize as his version of a laugh, not loud, barely anything, just a small collapse of the usual gravity around his mouth. She had noticed it a few times before, and had found that she liked it in a way that was separate from any calculation. It was just a thing she liked. They walked back to the wagon at the end of the afternoon, and she was carrying a jar of peaches she'd traded a loaf of bread for, and he took it from her without comment and put it in the wagon bed, and she climbed up to the seat, and they drove back to the ranch in the late gold of the July evening, with the horses in a loose, easy trot and the air smelling of sage and coming hay. She did not say anything for a while. He did not either. Then he said, watching the road, "You're good with people." She thought about this. "I'm direct with them," she said. "Some people take that for friendliness. I take it for honesty." She looked at him. He was still watching the road. "That might be the nicest thing you've said to me," she told him. "Might be." The corner of his mouth shifted. She looked back at the road ahead and allowed herself to feel that too. In the same quiet way, she'd allowed herself to feel Walt's compliment about the stew, and Ty's unrestrained enthusiasm for biscuits, and the sight of Gideon covering the leftover cake with a cloth to keep it. Small things. But she had always believed that small things were where the truth lived if you were paying attention. August brought the hardest stretch. Long days and short nights, and the kind of work that ground at a person, the haying and the fence mending, and the full heat of a Montana summer that came with no apology. She was up before 5 every morning without exception. She put up preserves from the garden she had quietly coaxed into production through June and July. She cured a side of pork in the cellar using her grandmother's method, the one that required nothing but time and the right amount of salt and a cold enough space. She dried herbs she'd found growing half wild at the edge of the north pasture, sage, thyme, something that might have been oregano gone to seed, and hung them in the kitchen in loose bundles. The kitchen smelled different than it had in March. This was something she noticed herself, not because anyone said so, but because smells are a kind of memory, and she was beginning to have memories here. The smell of this kitchen in August was already different from the smell of it in April, and different again from May, and this accumulation of small sensory differences was, she thought, what a home felt like in the making. One evening in late August, Gideon came in from a long day and found her at the kitchen table with a book open and a cup of tea going cold beside it, and he stopped. She looked up. "You read," he said. Not quite a surprise, more like a fact he was filing away. "When there's time," she said. "What is it?" She tilted the cover toward him. It was a survey of practical plant medicine, the kind of book that was half botany and half farmwife knowledge, the sort of thing her mother had owned. He crossed the room and looked at it over her shoulder, closer than he'd stood near her before. She kept very still. "Where did you get this?" "I brought it from Bozeman. I've had it since I was 19. He straightened up. She looked up at him, and he was already looking down at her, and there was a moment that lasted a small amount of time but had the weight of something larger. "There's a plant," he said, "at the edge of the south pasture. Low-growing gray-green leaves. The cattle won't touch it. Describe it more." He did, in the slow, careful way he described things when he was being precise. She listened. When he finished, she nodded. "I think I know what that is. I'll come look at it." "Tomorrow morning," he said. "Before the heat." "Before the heat," she agreed. She was there at 6 the next morning, in her boots and her working dress, the book tucked under her arm. He was already there, standing at the edge of the pasture, and he pointed it out without preamble, and she crouched down beside the plant and looked at it for a long time. "It's not dangerous," she said finally. "Not to cattle. It's bitter, and they know it. Might be useful if you had a lame horse. There are people who use the root as a poultice. My mother did once. But it won't hurt the herd." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the plant and then at her. "You know a great deal," he said, "for a woman who came with 2 trunks and a letter." She stood up. The morning light was long and pale across the pasture, and she could smell the dew still in the grass. "I had a lot of years to learn things," she said. "I didn't spend them sitting still." He looked at her with the expression she had come to think of as his most open one. Not warm, exactly, but unguarded. The expression of a man not trying to be anything other than what he was. "No," he said quietly. "I see that you didn't." They walked back to the house together, a little closer than they usually walked, and she made coffee, and he had his before the hands came in for breakfast, and she stood at the stove, and he stood at the window, and they talked, in a low and practical way, about the south pasture, and what to do about the far section of fence, and about the fall that was coming and what it would require. It was ordinary conversation. But she had been listening to ordinary conversation her whole life, and knew how much could live inside it when the people talking trusted each other even a little. September came with the first cold, and the preparations that cold required. She put up the last of the garden and set the root cellar in order, and made sure the wood stores were what they needed to be. She made a heavy bean soup with the last of the summer's pork, and served it on the first cold evening in early September, and the kitchen was warm and full, and the men ate without the rush of summer. Slowly, the way people eat when the season is changing, and there is something restful in that. Walt said, leaning back in his chair, that he hadn't eaten like this since his mother's table, and that this was not hyperbole. Ty said he didn't know what hyperbole was, but he agreed with whatever Walt said. Chet and Roy, who rarely addressed her directly, both thanked her before they left the table, which they had not done in the early weeks. She accepted this with the same quiet matter-of-factness that she accepted most things and went back to the stove. Gideon stayed after. This was not unusual now. He stayed most evenings, sometimes for a few minutes and sometimes longer, and she had arranged herself to this as she had arranged herself to everything else in this place, by understanding it clearly and making room for it and not requiring it to be something other than what it was. He sat with his coffee and she washed up, and the kitchen was quiet except for the fire. "The Abbott land," he said. "He's thinking of selling the east section." She turned around. She knew the Abbott land. She'd heard enough about it over the summer to understand its position relative to the Calloway water rights. "Would that matter to you?" she asked. "It would matter a good deal," he said, "if someone else bought it." She dried her hands and came to the table and sat across from him, the way she had in May. This time it was not unusual. "Then you should look at the money," she said. "I can tell you what the figures look like. After the summer, better than I expected." He looked at her for a moment. "You've been keeping it that closely. I've been keeping it correctly," she said. "There's a difference." He almost smiled. She had learned by now to recognize the approach of it, the slight shift in the lines around his eyes before his mouth quite got there. "Let me see the ledger," he said. She brought it and they sat over it together, and she walked him through the summer's numbers. And outside the window, the September dark came in full and cold and clean, and the cattle settled in the pasture, and the horses shifted in the barn, and the ranch was quiet in the way that it had become, through the months, her particular kind of quiet. Not the quiet of a spare room in her sister's house, not the quiet of diminishment. This was the quiet of a place that held her. She did not say this to Gideon. Some things lived better in the not saying. But she thought he might know it anyway, in the particular way that a man who doesn't talk much learns to understand what doesn't get said. He closed the ledger and looked up. "Thank you," he said. It was the first time he had said it to her directly, for anything, and she understood that he did not say it lightly. "You're welcome," she said, with the same evenness she used for everything. He stood to go. He stopped at the door, the same way Walt had stopped after the venison stew, and looked back at her. "The hands talked about going into town for a meal on Saturday," he said. "They won't go." She looked at him. "Why not?" He held her gaze for a moment. "Because they'd rather be here," he said, and then he went out. She sat at the kitchen table for a while after that, in the warmth of the stove, with the ledger closed and her coffee cooling, and outside the window the stars were beginning to come clear in a way they only did on the first true cold nights of fall. She had come here with 2 trunks and a letter, and a reputation for being unremarkable. The ranch was in order, the cellar was full, the accounts were straight. The men at this table had not set foot in the Grover Inn for the better part of a month, and Gideon Calloway had paused at the door of his own kitchen to tell her so. She picked up her coffee cup and held it in both hands and let the warmth of it settle into her palms. It was enough. For now it was more than enough.